Hello, my name is Legislator Jason Richberg, and I'm here with Jordan Zaia. He is an intern here in our office, our virtual internship. And so Jordan had an idea to do a series of videos to explain our federal government, our state and local governments, and sort of break down how it all works. And so we love this idea. And so what we did is we said we're going to do a series of video sessions. So Jordan is an intern from Penn State University. He majors in political science and history with a minor with a legal studies certificate. And I'm going to turn over to Jordan to introduce yourself.
And so thank you. So, hey, everyone, I'm Jordan, and I'm glad to get to present this to you because civics are really such an important topic, especially very current as 2020 was a presidential election year. And it's really been in the media as well with the Georgia runoff elections. So this is kind of at the forefront of everything going on. So what better time to learn about, what do we have within the federal government and the foundations of the federal government. So the governing document of our federal government is the United States Constitution, which was written in 1787. And in that Constitution, there's the Preamble, which is kind of just like the introduction to it. And then there's the 27 amendments and the articles. And the first 10 amendments in particular are known as the Bill of Rights. And these provide the basic civil liberties for all residents of the United States of America.
So Jordan, you bring up 1787, and I guess here I'm going to be representing everyone. But I thought our country was founded in 1776. So what's the gap? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so the first attempt came with the Articles of Confederation, which unfortunately, it did not give enough power to the federal government due to the fact that, at the time, a lot of people were scared of a strong central government due to the monarchy in England that they just broke free from, that they just became independent from. So the states had too much power and it wasn't a unified government. So they decided, hey, let's try again. And there came the US Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation.
Thank you.
And the Preamble, you've probably heard this. If not, Schoolhouse Rock is has a great video kind of to make this catchy for you. But it just states, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And this is basically just stating that this is going to be the law of the land, just basically introducing the importance of this document, that it's still here centuries later.
And I think what's important there, especially in everything that's going on in 2020, is in order to form a more perfect union. I think it's the inherent language there that says we're not perfect. And the only way to be perfect is for us to keep working together, right? As we the people. And we the people in 1787 does not mean the same thing in 2021.
Yeah, that's exactly. In the Constitution originally, there was a lot of different debates over what means citizenship, and it's totally different from now as we have a more inclusive sort of society in terms of citizenship, the abolition of slavery, the 14th Amendment gaining equal rights for all. So yeah, in order to form a more perfect union, it also shows how it's more of a living document as well, as amendments can come to the floor, as again, we've had 17 more after these 10 Bill of Rights, and how it's just ever changing to adapt to society, as hopefully this would be the governing document for the United States of America, not just for 50 or 100 years, but it's already been there for about 300 years almost now. And that kind of shows the dynamics of this document.
Thank you. What's next?
And then we go to the Bill of Rights, which would more so fall under the Bill of Liberties, as these are more so protections from the federal government that they can be looked at. And we can start off with the First Amendment, which is more so known as the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but it provides so much more in freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government to redress any grievances. So the First Amendment, it provides any, as we saw throughout this year in 2020, we saw a lot of peaceful protests, and that is protected under the First Amendment. And freedom of the press as well, that came really early with a bunch of issues early on, which made the freedom of the press more vital than anything else in terms of the rise of the newspaper. And then freedom of speech is basically the foundation of democracy. Without differing ideas, then and not being able to freely express yourself, then you won't be able to see two sides, which is why the First Amendment really kind of brings everything together out of all the Bill of Rights and this whole document.
And so, freedom of the press is the ability of the press to do what exactly?
To express themselves freely. So the press can be critical of who is in charge or who's whatever administration is there. And the press can, if something's going to be damaging, they can still release it because that's ultimately their job and they have the freedom to do their job. And that's all really going towards that main kind of establishment of expression, where a lot of things are looked at as expression. We've seen the Supreme Court many times, trying to see, oh, would this fall under expression? But the main baseline of it is that the expression can bring for dissent, which makes up the democracy through the First Amendment.
Because prior to this, many people could not speak up against their government. Papers were seized, right? There was all of these things that happened all over the world, prior to this. And then, the right to assembly, I guess, 2020 is definitely the year of assembly. But if you look into the civil rights movement, I think the right to assemble then was so important. Having organizations being able to get together and march and talk and view and express their concerns, especially in the civil rights era. And if you want to talk about the Vietnam era as well, those are two differing or similar events where people were assembled.
Absolutely. And before this, we know of the American Revolution, how the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, the right to assemble just wasn't there under the British government while we were just a colony. So that made it ever more important to be put into our Constitution, because they saw the tyrannical effects that the crown had, which ultimately led to the whole revolution and independence. So that's why the assembly was there. The Boston Massacre, it could speak for itself in that assembly. And
Crispus Attucks, right?
Yeah.
First person killed was a former slave named Crispus Attucks. Right? If you all don't know who Crispus Attucks is, that's I guess your first homework from Jordan today. All right, Jordan, what's next?
The next we have the Second and Third Amendment. So the Second Amendment gives citizens the right to bear arms, and the Third Amendment is prohibiting the government from quartering troops in private homes. And this really isn't as current. It's not really as utilized, but during the Revolution and during the times that the U.S. was not independent and just colonies, the British troops would just go into the homes of the people and they would just stay there. They would quarter there. So that made this very vital to put in the Constitution to prohibit that. It's your property. It's your home. The government can't tell you that you have to keep this person here. And then
it was beyond just keeping them, right? I think the Second Amendment, I think a lot of people know the right to carry a weapon and the right to have, different states have rules and laws about that, but most people know that. But the Third Amendment is important because not only were they moving into your house, they would kick you out, or you would be they'd kick you out and leave your family there, and your family would have to tend to the soldiers in whatever way that meant. And I think that's an important conversation as well.
Yeah, and that goes even further into seeing that a lot of the Bill of Rights was correcting issues that they saw from the British rule, which is something very interesting when looking at the entire basically governance of the early republic of the US. Just seeing that they're kind of just correcting what they do wrong, how can we make this better? And I thought that was really interesting.
It's addressing the needs of the moment, right? Or the recent moments.
Yeah, exactly. It's just seeing this didn't work. This didn't give us any power, or, power of the people is the democracy. And under the crown, under the monarchy, it wasn't letting them do any of that. So just seeing the corrections there in order to two different, completely different regimes, seeing the contrasting kind of features is very interesting.
All right, what do we have next?
That brings us to the Fourth Amendment, which, again, a very, very important amendment. It protects citizens from any unreasonable search and seizure, which means that, if they were to search you, they must have a warrant and probable cause. However, there are some caveats to it. If you're in a public school, then they only need reasonable suspicion to search you. That comes under New Jersey v. TLO. And also, something else that's very important, another landmark Supreme Court case regarding the Fourth Amendment was Mapp v. Ohio, which established the exclusionary rule. So say the government is going to search, or say they have a warrant to search for guns in your home. If they find something else illegal in your house, the warrant isn't to search for that, it's to search for the guns. So the other illegal stuff would just be inadmissible evidence if it were to be brought to trial, which is something that really protects the people from, again, that unreasonable search and seizure, because they didn't have any kind of burden or benchmark, that probable cause to actually search for that. It's searching for something else instead, which, again, is basically the right to privacy under the Fourth Amendment.
And I guess, I think this is one of those amendments that have been probably in the courts, if as much, if not as the First and the Second Amendment, right? I think these are, unreasonable search and seizures, can they just barge into your house? Do they have to, you talk about no-knock warrants, you talk about the different ways that different police forces and, departments around the country implement their searches and seizures. And this was an idea, back then to try and formalize it. And so there's one way, and I guess that also goes back to the conversation about the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, is that, people were going from state to state to search without informing local law enforcement as well. And I think, the conversation, I think this is one of those things that we all need to talk about, because, what are your rights if there's a warrant to search your property? What are the things you can and cannot do in a situation when you're involved with law enforcement? How does probable cause and, unreasonable search and seizure, how do they balance each other? And I think that's a conversation almost for a whole other presentation. But, these are things that people think about when you talk about the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, and the one thing about the Fourth Amendment, which is I think this is it's a very vital amendment to be aware of and to know, your protections under, because many people could be seen to, if they see someone at their door saying that they have to search for something, they may not be sure that they have to have a warrant or a probable cause, which can in turn lead to controversy or maybe an overstep. So knowing those rights that, oh, can I ask for a warrant, or do you have probable cause for that warrant? That really is kind of bringing more protections against anything else. And it's really vital to know as a resident of the US.
Right. And what am I, what am I allowed to ask, right? Or not ask, right?
And that kind of plays in to the next amendment,
Ah,
which is the Fifth Amendment. It basically has this amendment's kind of loaded up. It says that citizens, they can't be subject to prosecution without due process. And this due process amendment, this is something that we see in Miranda v. Arizona, which brought about the famous Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent.
hmm.
And basically, double perjury also cannot, or double jeopardy, my apologies, cannot be a thing where, say, you're found not guilty for, say, you're allegedly robbed a bank, and say you're found not guilty. They can't try you on that same exact case again. That's your binding decision. You're not guilty. And also, you're protected from that self-incrimination, which, like in Miranda, you have the right to remain silent. You can confer with an attorney. You probably heard the famous term "I plead the fifth" to kind of protect yourself from any sort of, will I give this away, or something to that extent. And eminent domain also is another part of the Fifth Amendment, which is very overlooked. It's basically saying that the federal government cannot just seize any private property without just compensation. And there can be sort of debates over what just compensation is, but there have been sort of cases of eminent domain that have went to the Supreme Court, and I'm blanking on the exact case, but it was very unpopular. It was pretty recent. It was very unpopular and actually kind of ruined the town. But in response to that case, many local and state legislatures actually passed laws to kind of go back and limit themselves from any eminent domain, which kind of it goes into the checks and balances and the power of the courts, which we'll get to later in the presentation. But this amendment is really just packed.
Yeah, it is. This is a very full amendment. But I will say that the Fifth Amendment also, we talk about double jeopardy. It only applies if you are charged and already tried. It doesn't matter. It does not have anything to do with, and I will lend to the legal scholars who are probably going to be watching this and debating things we're saying. But it does not apply to those folks who are charged and the charges are dropped, or things were not brought to trial. I think that's an important difference here, because a lot of times people don't necessarily know that. And when you talk about eminent domain, I will just circle back to the largest time in which eminent domain was happening was really between the 30s and the late 50s, especially during I can't think of the time now, but
Great Depression.
yes, during the Great Depression. Thank you. My old age is catching up to me. But during the Great Depression, when governments were seizing properties to start getting folks back to work, and then in the 50s when Eisenhower created the interstate system, and then locally you also had Robert Moses. So those are all like key things. If you want to do more research, especially on eminent domain, definitely look at those.
Yeah, and then going from the Fifth Amendment to, we have another pretty packed amendment, the Sixth Amendment. It assures the right to a speedy trial, which is very important that it's a speedy trial by a jury of one's peers. And the reason why it's very important for the speedy trial is so the courts don't get backed up, and so somebody isn't just held in, say, custody for 20 years waiting for their trial. So that's a very important part of it. And then it also provides the accused the right to compel any testimony and to legal representation. And we see that also in Gideon v. Wainwright with the legal representation, where if you can't afford an attorney, then they have to be provided to you if you're going to go to trial or if you're going to go to court on, as somebody that's being charged with a criminal or civil, I believe, offense.
And it's in New York, that's where you have the ATB panel and the Legal Aid Society, and there are other organizations. In Suffolk County, those are the two that come to mind in terms of your right to legal representation. But also, I guess the speedy trial is always a question with some people. Because speedy, in some respects, some people think a year is long enough, and in other cases, depending on what it is, it could be 3 or 4 years. It's always, it depends on where you are. And I think there's no measurement. I think that's something the courts have really tried to balance, is what's the measurement for speedy trial, right? How do you, and I think Jordan and I are having this discussion, and we are not the foremost scholars on this, but these are things for you all to look up and reach out to and think about and have conversations about, because this is how government works. Yeah, Jordan, sorry.
Yeah, and kind of going back to the point of a jury by one's peers, there was a Supreme Court case also a couple years back, Edmondson v. Leesville, which ruled that discrimination in jury selection process was unconstitutional, because that was kind of a common practice, especially within the Edmondson case, that Edmondson was an African-American man, and he was going through these trials for a personal injury suit. And every single time that he would be in trial, he would not, certain demographics of the of the jury would be vaudeered and kept out by the opposing counsel. So, that made it to the Supreme Court and was found unconstitutional, to kind of ensure that it's more representative to be a jury of one's peers.
And I guess it's always a question of what's a jury of one's peers, right? I think that's a important conversation to have. Is a jury of one's peers someone in your own age group? Is a jury of one's peers someone in your area? Is it someone of your racial or ethnic background? Is it someone of your religious background? Because maybe all of those things. Is it somebody of your gender, or somebody, or a group of folks who are non-binary? Those are all questions that a jury of one's peers is really, really, those are really important conversations. And then to say that, if you're over 18, and you are registered to vote, or you have a license, you're in the jury selection pool. And a lot of folks do not answer their jury summonses. A lot of people say, oh my gosh, it's the jury thing. But, that's one of the ways that you can make a difference in someone's life, serving on those juries.
Yeah, and that's definitely, another way to be involved with, this whole process within the government, and, a civic duty that can be looked at, and something that's very important, especially, during these times, and, as society keeps moving forward, to kind of do the part of jury duty if called upon. So that way all these trials can get the jury of one's peers and get fair trials as well.
I remember a quick story that when my father had jury duty, I think he had it 3 times. And I kept saying, like, why are you enjoying this so much? And he says, because you know what? This is what you're supposed to do. This is why we're here. I can't expect more from someone else if I'm not willing to do it myself. And that's sort of the attitude he had with, all of the aspects of his life of giving back to his church and serving on the board there, and, his work, for his job in the federal government. But, he really, really talked about, how, not that he was trying to get on juries, but how important it was for him to be there. And then, as a kid, you listen, but you're not really hearing. But today, going over this, I'm thinking, how important how right he was at that moment in time.
Definitely. And then this brings us to the 7th and 8th Amendments. So the 7th Amendment is more of a shorter amendment. It's just stating that civil cases are also to be tried by a jury of one's peers. And then the Eighth Amendment, it's basically known as the Cruel and Unusual Punishment Amendment. Prohibits any excessive bail, fines, sentencing, and one kind of hotly debated topic within the Eighth Amendment is the death penalty that may arise. It's been in the news recently as kind of a topic of debate, and has been kind of sporadically
Right.
throughout the years.
And how it's and not only just a death penalty, but how it is what defendants are given the death penalty is also a part of that. And when you talk about unusual excessive fines and penalties, I think there was a case within the last 2 years. I remember a intern of mine, actually, Logan Mazer. So I know he's going to watch this, so I'm giving him a shout out. He had brought up a case in which you couldn't fine someone more than the value of their vehicle, and that had came up on the Supreme Court. And I think somebody was given a fine of a couple $1,000s, but their vehicle was only worth $2,000. And is that an excessive fine and a cruel and unusual punishment? And I don't have all the details of the case, but I think those are things that are also that are questions that happen in our society. Like, what is cruel and unusual? Is it just torture? That's it's a question that had definitely happened after 2000, after 9/11, in terms of how we dealt with enemy combatants, but also how we deal with our own citizens.
Yeah, definitely. And do you know how the Supreme Court ruled in that case?
I believe, and Logan's gonna yell at me once he sees this, I believe they said that you cannot find it. It has to be commensurate with the value of the property. It can't be more excessive than the property. So if you have $1 million car, you can't be fined $1 million. Right? I don't have $1 million car, and Jordan, you don't have $1 million car. Maybe you do. Maybe you're hiding. But if you have, but the same thing as a $30,000 car, you shouldn't have a $30,000 fine. It should be commensurate. But I don't know what the implementation of that was, and how it was, and how where that is in the rest of how it's being administered throughout the rest of the country.
Going into the implementation of cases, that's something we'll get to on the Supreme Court slide, but it kind of goes to show like the checks and balances of the three branches of government, which we'll get to very soon after we finish up the Bill of Rights, which actually brings us to the last two amendments of the first 10, which are the 9th and 10th. And the 9th Amendment is very important because it's not just saying like, oh, okay, these 10 amendments are or any right listed in the Constitution. It's not saying that those are the only protections that you have. It's saying that it's not exhaustive and that you have more, even if they're not explicitly listed in there. And then the 10th Amendment is kind of going towards the federalism aspect in delegating any powers to the states that aren't explicit in the Constitution.
Or to the people.
Yep, to the states and the people.
Right. And I think the idea that it just goes, the 9th Amendment goes to the idea that this is not we're not living in a constitutional wall, right? The idea that the walls should be moving to fit the people and to fit how government changes and how countries change. But a lot of times we live, previously we lived in societies that are very static. And this was one of the first dynamic documents, short of the Magna Carta, but this is the most expansive document of that era, right? The Magna Carta, I think, was 500 years before this, but the idea that we would move forward and backwards, and expand and contract, and our republic has expanded and contracted along the years, and the idea that that the states do have authority and local governments do have authority and we do have responsibilities. And I guess, if 2020 is the year of the assembly, it's also the year of the local government, right? And the state government, how important they are in this whole process.
Yeah, I was just about to say 2020 exactly. Seeing how dealing with COVID was more of a state matter and how it differed within each state, whereas New York would be different from New Jersey, and New Jersey different from Florida, and Florida from Ohio, and all these different states that had different policies. It showed basically exactly what the 10th Amendment was saying. It's that it's going to be delegated to the states. And it was really interesting to see, especially sometimes the 10th Amendment can be one of the more forgotten amendments in the mainstream. But it was interesting to see at the forefront this year, and especially seeing the rest of the 10th Amendment in play. You can go to the school systems, you can go to setting up voting and elections, taxes.
Right. Because you can make, I think Jordan, you and I have had this conversation before. We don't have one election, right? Especially in the presidential level. We have 50 different elections that compile into one election. And that goes to the states' rights. The states have the ability to elect their representatives in whatever manner that they select, right? So, but there are broad-basing things that they have to do, and things they have to meet. But the fact that every state has their own process is important.
And that also goes to show too how it could be thought of the Constitution could hold everything, or that everything is just the federal government, or it's just on them, it's all their power. But it's interesting to see how many different kind of powers are within the state government, education and all these different aspects that are a part of daily lives for many people around the country.
Definitely. And I think we're going to talk about that in our state and local government conversation. So 10th Amendment, conversation, more coming soon.
Exactly. So that brings us to the three branches of government, which we have the legislative, executive, and judicial. And kind of the common phrasing is that the legislative makes the laws, the executive enforces or carries out the laws, and then the judicial is there to just interpret the laws. And going into Article 1 of the Constitution is laying out what the legislative branch is. And in the US, we have a bicameral legislature where we have the House of Representatives and the US Senate. And the House of Representatives has proportional representation, where if it goes by the state's population. So a state like New York has more representatives than a smaller state like Vermont or North Dakota. And in the Senate, there's even representation where every single state, no matter size or population, has 2 representatives and 2 votes in the Senate.
And that has been a debate, especially over the last couple of years, as to why certain states have the same authority, especially in the Senate, than others. And I think there's even been federal elected officials who've said that we should keep the Senate and keep the House, but merge them into one unicameral legislature. Which would that would be amazing to see how that would work out. I'm not going to say whether I'm for or against it, but the idea that the House of Representatives, that goes back to the founding of our country, and the idea that the states with more people are trying, and in that point in time they were also counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, and that's important. And Native Americans were also counted as well. And that's an important thing for everyone to understand. That states with more people, quote unquote, wanted to have more authority than those with less. And that's always been a push and pull. And that's why the census is so important, We just left the census year. We're in the middle of a census year, but the census is over. But that's why the census is so important, because where people live dictates your representatives in Congress.
And going off the census again, that's another way to really be involved and kind of doing that civic duty to make sure that the census really determines so much, as in how much money is going to be allocated to your area and to the different departments around you, and there's so much that will affect daily life, where an accurate census will go a long way for those 10 years where it's going to be enacted. And some interesting things about the two different branches. So the House of Representatives has the power of the purse, which means that they determine the budgets and taxes. And the Senate, they have the advice and consent clause, which means that any presidential nomination, as we've seen this year with the appointment or the nomination of Justice Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, it has to go through the census and be approved by them by a 50% plus one majority.
To the Senate, not the census. But so going back to the House of Representatives, there's always been 435 representatives. It doesn't matter what year we were in, whether it was 1787 or 1976 or 2020 or 2021. There's always been 435 members. And that's another conversation. Like, why are we locked at 435 members of Congress? And that's, that's something for us to all think about.
And something else with the Senate also, they, being the upper branch in the legislative branch, or the upper house in the legislative branch, they approve any bill that goes through the House to bring it to the president to sign and approve to be enacted.
And there's a disparity in the terms, right? If you're a senator, you serve a 6-year term, and then you're probably about to say this, but in the House, you serve a 2-year term. And some people say, is that enough time? I think in Suffolk County, we just had a ballot referenda to expand the terms of legislative seats from 2 years to 4 years, because some people believe it's enough time and some people believe it's not. Those are things, those are questions. Some people say the second you get elected, you got to start raising money, especially on the federal level for your next race. The question is that feasible for our society, or is it not? I think that's a healthy conversation for us all to have.
And something interesting too with the 6-year terms for the senators. So like I mentioned earlier, how both of the New York senators were not up for re-election. That's because there's 3 different classes of elections within them. So class 1 would be, their 6 years would be up a certain, say 2020. The other class would be up in 2022, and then the next one would be up in 2024. So it's not a complete turnaround every 6 years with all new senators coming in at once. It's that they're serving 6-year terms, but starting and ending within their class.
Right, and it's a different, right, and as opposed to the House of Representatives where everybody's up at the same time and everybody's up and in at the same time and everybody's out at the same time, right? So there's no question as to what's your cycle. So, and that's another interesting thing. Why does the Senate have that and why not the House? Like, why wouldn't you have, cycles, different cycles for everyone? But, that's where we are.
Then these are some of the legislative branch elected officials that we have here representing Long Island and New York. So in the U.S. Senate, we have Chuck Schumer. He's actually the Senate Minority Leader, which is up for change regarding the Georgia runoffs. But he is the Democratic leader of the Senate currently. And then we have Kirsten Gillibrand. She is the junior senator from New York. And then in District 1 of the House of Representatives, we have Representative Lee Zeldin.
And he represents the East End Forks up until where?
I believe he represents up until
like Brookhaven and parts of Iceland, I believe.
Yes. And then the representative from District 2, he was just elected this year, is Andrew Garbarino.
And he represents, Nassau County and Suffolk County. I think Nassau, I forgot how far west it goes.
To Wantagh,
Yeah, it's like Wantagh, Seaford area, all the way to the edge of the town of Islip.
and then from the New York 3, we have Thomas Swazi.
And he represents, I think, parts of the town of Smithtown, all the way to the north side of Suffolk County, north part of Nassau County, up into Queens.
And from the 4th district, we have Kathleen Rice.
And I believe she represents central well, she represents the edge of the side of Garbarino to right. She's got the middle part of Nassau County.
And lastly, in District 5, we have Gregory Meeks.
And he represents, I always get this wrong. I know it's to the Rockaways all the way into Nassau County. I know it's past the Elmont area, but I always forget where.
And just knowing the elected officials of your area is really kind of a huge avenue if you want to be involved with government, or if you want to express any grievances about stuff going on within the community and things that you think could be changed or want them to advocate on their behalf. And that's been something that we've seen very kind of commonly, especially this year, with many very important resolutions coming to the floor of the House, where these representatives have been gaining many phone calls and a lot of outreach, especially with the new kind of prominence of social media and people becoming involved civically, younger generations becoming involved in getting involved and reaching out. And it's kind of showing that involvement is to be translated to these representatives as well, and to kind of voice the concerns of the people, because that's who they're in turn representing. They're being elected to represent the people of their district or of their constituency for those reasons.
And what's important is that you find out who your state, who your congressional representatives are, who your Senate representatives is. We might have people who are not from New York State, and we apologize that we're not covering all 435. But we're gonna, Jordan and I had a long conversation about this. But if you're in the 15th legislative district, your congressman is Andrew Garbarino, or will be your congressman. Right now, as we're recording it, it's Peter King. But when you see this, it'll be Andrew Garbarino. And so reach out. Find out. If you're outside of the 15th legislative district in Suffolk County, reach out to your congressional representatives. Send them a letter, send them an email. Ask them a question. Government only works when we all communicate. And so I say that to me as well. If you have questions, we'll have our information there. But since we're talking about our federal elected officials, please reach out.
Reaching out and getting involved is kind of the best way for a democracy to truly be fully functioning, to govern for everybody. Because if your voice isn't being expressed, it's not being heard by those that are elected, and they can't act based on those silenced voices. So being involved and reaching out is super important for democracy to function.
Okay, what's next?
We have the executive branch, which is highlighted under Article 2. And this consists of the president, vice president, and they have their cabinet beneath them. And they're elected for 4-year terms, which, as we see, 2020 was an election year. The next one will be up in 2024. And they have 2-term limits, or can serve for up to 10 years. So in the past, we've had presidents who unfortunately passed away while in office. An example would be John F. Kennedy. And Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over to complete that term and then was reelected for another term. And the president, they deliver the State of the Union to the entire government, and they appoint any vacant positions, such as Supreme Court nominations and their cabinet and any department heads. And they're also the commander in chief of the armed forces. The U.S. has become a military power worldwide, and the president is the one that's ultimately their leader. He's their commander in chief. And to further go along that, the president is really the one who worked with the foreign relations with other countries in forming any alliances or peace treaties.
Right. She or he, whoever the president is responsible for those positions. And I think it's important to understand what the president can do and what the president can't do. I mean, there's a lot of authority and sway that the president has, but you also see that there's a balance between obviously the House of Representatives and the Senate. And government works best when we're all working together. And nothing shows that more than when you have people who aren't having conversations, because then the will of the people aren't getting done.
Yeah, and further going along that too, the president can also issue executive orders. They're not going to formally introduce legislation to the legislative branch, as they're the ones that make the laws. But the president can issue an executive order if they want policy to be passed. Presidents have exercised this in the past, whether it be President Trump, President Obama, President Bush, or President Clinton, and those before him and those before them.
It's funny you said that, because people think that executive orders are a new thing. And executive orders, I mean, date back, I don't know the full bout of it. I mean, you're closer to the educational aspect than I am, or learning this, but the earliest thing that I could think of is the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. People don't realize that. So executive order, now granted, they've been used more in recent times, recent meaning the last 100 years in our country, but executive orders have been around for a long time. And it's interesting. It's also interesting to know that the president does not submit legislation. That's a very interesting thing that not everybody knows, because not every level of government is like that. And we'll talk about that in the next couple of presentations.
And another thing to kind of go along with that too is that the president does have the power to veto legislation that say passes the Senate and comes to his desk. They can veto that and not have it enacted. And something interesting too about executive orders is that without the power of the purse or the kind of support from Congress, it may or may not have that same binding power as a piece of legislation would.
Right.
So
go ahead.
Oh no, you can go first.
No. This is your presentation. It's your show. I just work here.
So as of the recent election, the President-elect Joseph R. Biden from Delaware will be our 46th president of the United States. Actually, the 45th person to hold the position.
Interesting.
From Cleveland, back in the day, he was elected for one term, lost re-election, and then came back 4 years later and won his second.
So that's not a new thing. What year was Grover Cleveland? I'm putting you on the spot, but
I believe 1880s, I want to say.
So that's another set of homework from Jordan to everybody. When was Grover Cleveland president the first time and then the second time?
And then the vice president-elect is Kamala Harris, and she is to be the 49th vice president of the United States and the first woman and African-American to hold the position.
And Asian American.
Yes.
She has a lot of firsts.
And she previously served as a senator from the state of California, while President-elect Biden formerly was the 47th vice president to President Barack Obama from 2009 to 2017. And he also served in the Senate from Delaware.
And there's 49 vice presidents, because just because you are elected vice president does not mean that you're going to stay the vice president. Some people have left. Some people have become the president. Some people are maybe they're vice president in one term and they don't stay on to the second term. There's been a number of changes in it. That's why the numbers don't line up.
Yeah, and that kind of goes along, like the perfect example of that would be President Gerald Ford. So President Richard Nixon was first elected in 1968 with Spiro Agnew as his running mate. And then after re-election in 1972, Spiro Agnew steps down. So Gerald Ford was then appointed to be the vice president. And then after President Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford became the president of the United States. And one thing that was kind of a center of debate was that he was the first, I guess, non-elected president to serve.
He had never been elected. He'd been an elected official, but he had never been elected by the people of the United States. First time in history, and only so far. Let's not go back down that road. Any of those roads. Let's just leave those roads alone. All right, what's next?
The Judicial Branch. And they consist of the Supreme Court and any lower courts, such as the appellate courts, district courts. And their main role, as said earlier, is to interpret the laws. And they were seen actually as the weakest branch, as in the elective branch had the power of the sword, as in they had the defense. The legislative branch had the power of the purse. But the judicial branch, they were a much weaker branch, especially at the start of the federal government and the Constitution. But that they gained more traction under Chief Justice John Marshall, especially with 1803's decision of Marbury v. Madison, which established judicial review. And this basically says that just because Congress or just because a law is passed, it doesn't mean that it's not violating the Constitution. So that kind of brings in that whole other avenue that they can deem any piece of legislation to be unconstitutional. And there are also other decisions that come to the Supreme Court. They aren't all constitutional. There are other decisions that would be based on legislation that is less binding, where it could just be overturned by Congress due to a new piece of legislation going in. But their constitutional interpretations are the ones that are really binding and the ones that really get followed. But again, they don't have the same enforcement power, which is why checks and balances and all the three branches working together is so vital. An example of this would actually be the Brown v. Board of Education decision, where just because that was passed, or just because that decision was rendered, that still didn't end all of the segregation in the school system. And I believe it was President Eisenhower who had to send the National Guard to actually help guide an African-American girl to her public school to protect her. So just because a decision is made, it doesn't mean that it is, I guess, going to be enforced.
And I think they are considered, I think prior to 1803, it was not necessarily considered an insult, but it wasn't, you didn't really want to be the Supreme Court on the Supreme Court. But they also, I would add that they are the reactive branch, right? Whereas the, Congress can make laws, the president can have executive orders, they're active in their abilities. Whereas the Supreme Court, they don't go out seeking cases. Someone has to bring a case to them and they have to accept it. They also handle interstate matters. They handle, lower court matters. It's not as direct, right? You don't just directly, if you have an issue, you can directly reach out to an elected official, your congressperson, your US senator, and say, hey, this is what I want to talk about. Whereas you can't really reach out to your Supreme Court justice and say, and ask for an opinion. It's not the same way that the other branches work.
Yeah, and especially going off how they're not elected. So Federal 78 was calling for, the independent judiciary, where it's leaving any kind of partisan matters away from constitutional disputes or any decisions rendered by the Supreme Court. So that gave them lifetime appointments. which means that they're not going to be constantly up for re-election, and their public opinion. Now, while public opinion is one of the more kind of important factors for the Supreme Court, their public perception to keep their legitimacy and prestige, they don't have the pressures, as they're not going to lose their jobs due to making a decision that goes against that. And there are currently 9 justices on the Supreme Court. We have Chief Justice John Roberts. We have Justice Samuel Alito, Justice Clarence Thomas. That's 3 so far. So we have Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who was just appointed this year, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was also appointed by President Trump, Justice Neil Gorsuch, who was appointed early in President Trump's term. And then we have Justices Sonia Sotomayor, who was appointed by President Obama, and Justice Elena Kagan, also appointed by President Obama. And lastly, Justice Stephen Breyer. And if there are any questions or additional points of clarity or any additional information, there's my contact information, my email, zaia@psu.edu. And here is the phone number for Legislator Richberg's office in District 15 of the Suffolk County Legislature if you want to reach out and get any more information to find out about the federal government and any matters related.
And you could also reach us at info.do15@suffolkcountiny.ny.gov. I want to thank Jordan for putting this together. I think you had this conversation with us in August or July, actually, when we were talked about this, and it's great to see that your work is coming to fruition. This is the first in a series of things. Jordan has a lot of energy, and he really wants to share his information. And I think it's important, especially in our office, our interns aren't just interns, right? We they all have their own projects. They're all working on their own things. I think this is like your 4th or 5th major thing that you've worked on. So I want to thank Jordan for this. I want to thank Mike Madia in our office. He's doing our tech stuff behind the scenes. You can't see him, but he's making this all come forward. And I want to thank Siobhan Davis Pierce, who's in charge of our internship program. So if you want more information about our internship program, you can reach out to us. And you could do some projects like this. And this isn't legislation. This is sort of something that came up just from Jordan's own ideas. And so I want to thank you for that. And this is our federal government segment. Jordan, is there anything else you want to say?
Thank you for taking the time, and to anybody watching at a later time, thank you for making it this far and watching and learning about the federal government. I hope everybody was able to pick up something and learn how you can be involved and how you can really take part in this whole democratic process. And to further go along with opportunities, if you're a high school or college-aged student, I'm going to throw in the PAGE program. Here I began with the Suffolk County Legislature's PAGE program, which is where I began in Legislator Richberg's office. And that is a great way to get involved with local government and learning all of the systems from Suffolk County. So if you're of that age, definitely I would look into that. You'll learn a ton, and it's a great experience. And thank you.
Shout out to Amy Ellis, the clerk of the legislature, who ran the PAGE program or runs the PAGE program. And I think that's how we got in contact with you, right? That's how you came to our office. So I want to thank Amy for bringing you to us, because people wouldn't have this information if it wasn't for Amy. So, or Madam Clerk. So thank you very much. And to everyone out there, I hope you learned something, and we love your feedback. This was not a partisan conversation. This is just trying to be straight down the middle as to how your government works on the federal level. And there's going to be further conversations about our state government and our local government. And then, we're going to have some other things that Jordan has up his sleeve. So, this is just a first in a series of things going on here. And so thank you very much for this opportunity, and have a great day.
Thank you.